Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have prepared a longer presentation, but I am not going to show it. In my 20 minutes, I would like to concentrate on something which I think is essential regarding the experience of post-socialist economists, but presentation is available from the organizers. Now, many countries in the world are poor. But when countries are poor or grow up very slowly, it is not because of natural disasters or natural reasons. In most cases, it is because of bad regimes and bad macroeconomic policies. And we know from massive experience that socialism was a very bad regime. For it not only violated human rights, but also produced in the longer run a very slow economic growth, and there was no one good example of good socialism. Why was so? First, because of a total concentration of political power. Under socialism, political power was also economic power due to the monopoly of state ownership, and this lesson should make people skeptical about links between political power and economic power. It did not stop only with socialism. Second, because of a total monopolization. There was no competition under socialism. And third, given this total concentration of political power, when this power came into the hands of crazy or incompetent individuals, you have disasters produced by policies. Stalin, human catastrophes. Mao, Khmer Rouge, and in the milder form, there were economically catastrophic policy during the late years of socialist economies in such countries like Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, huge foreign debt. So the lessons from history, not only from socialism, is that the worst policy are not under democracies, but under non-democracies. And there are very few good dictatorships. They are very rare. Most dictatorships are awful because they violate human rights, and they are very bad, as I said, for the economy, for economic growth. And the second lesson would be that the worst catastrophes which produce deep breakdowns in the economy are not due to markets, free markets, like many Western economists think, but by excessively concentrated political power. So limiting political power, introducing or maintaining checks and balances is like an insurance against the worst catastrophes. And this is not only theoretical in this country, I think. So there are many examples of catastrophes, economic and human catastrophes produced by concentrated political power, but I skip it. And let me say that against this bad experience of socialism, the collapse of this regime was a very good and positive news all over the former Soviet bloc. However, what has happened after this collapse in the longer run has differed, both in the economic and non-economic dimensions. And I think this is very instructive. What do we know? That the growth of the economy in the former socialist countries has sharply diverged in the longer run. Poland, my native country, has managed almost to double the GDP during the last 21, 22 years, while some other economies, including Ukraine, are still barely at the level of GDP which existed during the last year of socialism. Generally speaking, countries of Central and Eastern Europe has performed better economically than countries of the former Soviet Union. And what's less known is that countries which have achieved faster economic growth, achieved higher increase in per capita income, also achieved better results on life expectancy and mortality rate among children under 5 years old. So when you look at the data for life expectancy, You see, for example, in the Czech Republic, the same goes for Slovenia. The expected life expectancy at birth in years has moved from 71 in 1990 to 77 in 2007. Similarly for other Central European countries like Poland, while in Ukraine it has declined from 70 to 68. The same goes for Russia. And life expectancy and mortality rate of children under 5 years old has sharply declined in all Central European countries between 1990 and 2007, but it barely moved in Ukraine, from 25 to 24, while in Poland it has declined from 17 to 7. And there's a strong link between economic improvement and non-economic improvement. Now, what explains the differences in economic growth and economic performance? There's a massive research, so we don't need to speculate. We are on the solid empirical grounds. I think that based on this research, I would single out two main factors. First, the sharp differences in economic performance, especially economic growth, are largely explained by the different extent of market reforms and rule of law. It's not enough to have more markets. You need rule of law so that you have equal protection of property rights and you are not afraid of your own state. So countries which moved more in the direction of honest markets, rule of law, equal protection of property rights have achieved better results than those who moved less. And second, important factor is the extent to which economies have suffered booms and busts. Booms are of two kinds: fiscal, if governments spend too much, and private credit boom. And most booms are produced by bad policies, bad monetary and fiscal policies. The same goes for Spain, for Ireland, for the United States, for Britain, but also for Bulgaria, the Baltics, and for Ukraine. There was a huge boom in Ukraine between 2004 and 2007, and there was a collapse of almost 15% in 2009. This was produced by policies. There was not a natural disaster. So if you know, longer-term growth is like driving a car in the race, long-term race. You need a good car, which is reforms. With Trabant, you cannot beat Mercedes, but you need a prudent driver also. The driver which would, that's a metaphor to expansionary policies, fiscal and monetary policies. This is very imprudent because it produces first booms, and everybody likes it, and then there is a bust, and everybody is unhappy. So prudent macroeconomic policies are the second factors. And the fact that Poland has achieved the largest increase in GDP between 1990 and 2011 is due to these two factors. First, we introduced many reforms, but the Baltics have introduced even more reforms. But the second factor, that in Poland we have avoided extreme booms, and as a result we have avoided deep recession so far. And Poland has been growing during the last 4 years, while some countries' GDP has been declining. And I am coming at the end to the question, why? Now, regarding the first factor, extent of reforms, it is about what systems have emerged after the collapse of socialism. Depending on the nature and the extent of reforms, there are different systems, different institutional systems prevailing in the former socialist countries. Now we know, as I said, that there is no one good example of good socialism. If you have a monopoly of state ownership, you can't have democracy, you have a total politicization of economic life, and you can't grow in the longer run. That's a very bad system. So it is only capitalism which is capable of producing better economic performance and non-economic performance, but there are different kinds of capitalism. And former socialist economy were moving to different kinds of capitalism. And this explains the different results in economic and non-economic growth. There are many ways in which you can block the development potential of capitalism by distorting it. So if you have a distorted capitalism, you can't be very successful compared to more free market and rule-based capitalism. What are the main distortions which block the development potential of capitalism? First, as I mentioned, a very uneven protection of private property rights, which is usually called crony capitalism, which means that there's a minority of politically connected businessmen and a discriminated majority. And under such a system, it's not only unjust, it's also inefficient. This unequal protection of property rights, it means also creates uncertainty, and under such regimes, it often happens that state apparatus is used in competitions, which is a destructive competition, raiding, for example. And you can't be successful under such a system in the long run. Individual businessmen can, but economy can't. Second, lack of competition, which is to some extent related to the first factor, unequal protection of private property rights. But it may also be brought about by formal or informal barriers, trade barriers. Without competition, capitalists cannot work well. It can work a little better, only a little better than socialism. So you have to look at the barriers to competition. And for example, in Greece, there's probably very little competition, because if you look at export to GDP ratio in Greece, a small country is only 20%. And in small country, competition mostly comes from outside. So something has been wrong with competition. Third, if you have predatory regulation which produces hard businessmen, and it is unpredictable, it's of course very bad. Then if you have a heavy taxation, then taxes consist of two parts, official taxes and corruption payments. So you have to sum up these two. Then it may turn out that most businesses, except for the privileged ones, have a very heavy taxation. Under very heavy taxation, you can't grow. Official taxes are high always when spending is high. And when spending is high, it is usually social spending. And social spending, when it is high, it is usually badly targeted, which means only a small percentage of poor people really get social benefits. And most of the benefits would come to richer people. And I think this is the case of Ukraine. Then, so as you can see, it's not enough to abolish socialism. The real challenge is to build free market, rule-based capitalism, and if you don't, you can't be very successful. And the difference, as I can see, between Central Eastern Europe economies and most countries of the former Soviet Union is that there's a lot more of competition, separation of politics from business, and rule of law in Central Europe than in these other countries. So they have to catch up in these respects. Now, what is also worth stressing, and I am doing this on purpose, being here, that if you look at the experience of Central and Eastern European countries, former Soviet bloc, you see that those who reformed the most in the economy are also most democratic. Central Eastern European have the same level of democracy like the West, according to the existing rankings. And the most reforms have been done in these countries, which at the minimum shows that there is no conflict, no inherent conflict between democracy and market reforms and economic growth. Of course, democracy also requires rule of law, not only elections, but rule of law, which means you limit the power of the government, of the state. This is the essence of the rule of law. Nobody is above the law. No rulers are above the law. So Central Europe shows that you can combine market reforms and democracy and rule of law, and the best economic results. While the worst economic results are found in some countries which have diverged from democracy in our region. I don't think Belarus is a success story. For some, it's not a success story. It's a clear violation of human rights, as recently witnessed, and without Russian subsidies, there would be a disaster in Belarus. There are huge subsidies from Russia to Belarus, so certainly it is not a good model for any reasonable person. Now, let me move to the prospects of Europe very briefly. That's a big topic. And it is well known that 2012 will be a more difficult year, that the average growth in European Union is 0. Of course, there are some divergences. Say Poland, Lithuania, Estonia are expected to grow about 2%, while Greece and Portugal would be on the decline. Now, this does not mean that this situation has to prevail in the longer run. And European Union still is a hugely important economic bloc, especially for countries which are close to it geographically. But let me add that speaking about solutions to the problems in countries which have problems, like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, I would say that there are no European solutions for Italian problems. There are Italian solutions for Italy and for Europe. What do I mean by that? I mean by that if a large country develops problems because of previous errors, it is up to this country to correct these problems, because there are no bailout which would be sufficient for Italy. There's such a huge country, the third largest debt in the world. And I just returned from Italy, from the conference with Prime Minister Monti, and I think there's a good chance for Italy to overcome the problems via reforms. You overcome your problems with corrective policies, not with bailouts. Meaning official credit can help you only if it leads or supports good programs. But if official credit does not support a good program, it is destructive. Okay, what does it mean, the most demanding external environment for the respective countries? Means that the only compensating factor for this more demanding external environment are better policies. And in every country there is a scope for better policies, technically speaking. There's one country which I know the best, which is Poland, but I am not going to be very detailed about this. But let me say, from a distance and from a time perspective, what in my mind would be the most important conditions for success so far in Poland. We have our problems, to be sure, too. For example, our courts are too slow, but they are independent and not corrupt, but they are too slow. Our taxes are too high because our spending is too high, even though it is lower than in Ukraine. But what would be the conditions for success for Poland so far? First, I think because we have avoided booms and bust. So we have avoided extreme booms, which are always fueled by credit. Why it is so? Well, we have had a rather disciplined monetary policy, which was focused on lowering inflation. When we started in 1989, I remember inflation was 30–40% a month, like in Ukraine. But finally we brought it to 2–3%, and we switched 12 years ago to inflation targeting. So we have avoided the peg to $1 to a euro. By the way, if you want to maintain a peg, you have to have a very solid public finance. If your public finances are fragile, then the peg is under attack, and there's an uncertainty, and foreign direct investment is discouraged, because people are afraid that there may be forced devaluation. So monetary policy regime, it's important for growth, and there are certain requirements for pegs. Coming back to Poland, I think why we have avoided extreme fiscal booms our fiscal policy was far from perfect, but was not catastrophic. It was, I think, because in 1997, in our constitution, we have introduced a special article which says that public debt to GDP cannot exceed 60%. And the ordinary legislation introduced two thresholds, 50%, 55%, after which corrective actions are mandatory. To be sure, 60% is too high. So for Ukraine, it's too high. So if you introduce threshold, it should be lowered. But if you introduce something in the Constitution, it makes sense only if Constitution is respected. If Constitution remains on paper, it doesn't matter, which is ultimately about the rule of law. Now that I can see on the reform sides, I think there are two ingredients for Poland's success. First, from the very beginning, there was a clear separation between politics and business. We did not have politically privileged businessmen. No businessmen who deserved their wealth because of political connections. So there was no crony capitalism in Poland, basically. Uniform rules, reasonably equal protection for everybody, for every private businessman. And second, from the very beginning, we introduced massive competition. We dismantled monopolies. We opened the economy to the external world. And there were no informal barriers to competition because there were not informally privileged businessmen. So we have massive competition and reasonably equal treatment of private ownership, plus, of course, privatization. I think probably these are the most important reasons for Poland's success during the 20 years. I'm not going to say what should be done directly in Ukraine. Coming from outside Ukraine, I would not dare to see, but I think everybody would see what would be some lessons for Ukraine. Certainly, the general lesson would be that if there are many distortions in the economy, it has been bad for the past, because with very distorted system, a country was not able to grow fast in the past. But with many distortions, you have ample room for improvement. So you can do many reforms which would improve. And there are many reforms one can see even from the distance which could improve Ukrainian economy, to start with huge inefficiency with energy, which makes Ukraine first fiscally fragile because of huge subsidies to energy. Second, dependent on Russia, which makes it less independent, etc. So there are some economic measures which are extremely important. Some other reforms which one can see from a distance, like politically, not clean separation between politics and business would require the political change from the very top, because this is a political reasons for such a system, and this always requires energetic civil society. And to finish, let me say there is one issue which is at stake: the Ukrainian connection with the European Union, the possibility of signing the deep trade treaty, which is on the table. And there is a readiness on the European Union side to sign it, but would never come with the present policies regarding the selective justice or rather injustice. Even if there was some readiness on the side of the officials in the European Commission, it requires the signing the treaty by the respective governments. And it would not happen without a change in this sort of policies which I mentioned. And signing the deep integration treaty of Ukraine and the European Union, according to the calculation which is available, would be of great importance to Ukraine, great economic importance. So you have one advantage in Ukraine. Ukraine has one advantage, but the move is on the Ukrainian side.